Now I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker. Dr. Tom Fuller has taught computer science, math, and engineering at Principia College in Elsa, Illinois for 3 decades. He has served as faculty senate president and for 1 year as acting president of the college. Tom has written for the Christian Science periodicals and for professional books and journals. He was the project manager for the original Concord study package, released in 1988. How cool is that? How has that changed our lives? An avid nature lover, Tom has led bird walks at Principia and has photographed over 500 bird species. All the photographs in this slide presentation, and that's why the room is darkened here for those who aren't in the auditorium. Seeing a lot of slides here. All the photographs are his own, except for those taken from space, which came from NASA. Tom has long served as Associate Director of Principia's Astronomical Observatory, guiding hundreds of visitors to the wonders of our galaxy. And I was one of them last year. It was amazing. Currently, he is a trustee of Peace Haven, our sister facility in St. Louis, and his first reader at his branch church. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Tom Fuller and his talk, Upbuilding Church and Its Activities.
Thank you, John. I've never been able to figure out these computer things. You'll have to give me some time here. I think it's a passing fad. I don't think they're going to catch on. Okay. So how much core have we got here, Joe?
How much do you need?
I think we're okay. More than that. I need a little more here. Yep. Oops. Well, if it doesn't work out, I can just tell some fishing stories or something here. We'll be okay. How about that?
Okay.
I can do that. How about that?
There we go.
Okay. Anybody recognize that? Now the real question is, where was I standing when I took that picture? I don't want you to too high an estimate of my metaphysics there. I was in a boat, yes. Okay. That should look familiar also. If it doesn't, I'm in the wrong building at the wrong time here. Well, thanks for letting me be here. Thanks for being here with me. And thanks to John for inviting me back despite the talk I gave here some years ago. My wife's mom lived here for a while. I visited this wonderful facility a number of times, and I've received Christian Science nursing care here. It's a great privilege to share this time with you. Hey, give me a second here to get organized. Arden Wood is really more than a building, though, isn't it? It is a beautiful building, but it's also an idea, as we heard so richly from those who have spoken of this already. The peace, the care, the light that is felt even by ambulance captains. It speaks to that invisible part of the building. It speaks to Arden Wood as an idea. We'll have lots more to say about that later. Now, you've probably been wondering about the title of the talk. Upbuilding church, is that even a word? I'm kind of wondering about it myself. I was struck by Mrs. Eddy's description of the first Church of Christ Scientist. She said it's designed to be built on the rock, Christ. Even the understanding and demonstration of divine truth, life, and love, healing and saving the world from sin and death, thus reflect in some degree the church universal and triumphant. Well, I think we're all pretty clear about building on the rock. As Jesus taught, unless we build on the rock, if we end up building on sand, the building won't withstand the storms. Lawrence Doyle observed a number of years ago in one of his talks that sand is just a lot of tiny rocks, quartz, in fact. If we build on the oneness of mind, the onlyness of mind, we're building on the rock Christ. If we build on the assumption that there are many little minds with shifting opinions and differing expectations and natterings, we're building on sand, a perfect recipe for getting washed away in the next storm. So we get that part of the definition. But why designed to be built? Isn't church already built? Are we done yet? Mrs. Eddy says in the chapter Genesis of Science and Health, creation is ever appearing and must ever continue to appear from the nature of its inexhaustible source. Mortal sense inverts this appearing and calls ideas material. So if God creates church, and of course he does, it must be that in truth, church also is ever appearing, ever unfolding, even while material sense calls it a structure, a thing, a done deal, so to speak. Speaking of the original edifice, Mrs. Eddy wrote in Miscellaneous Writings, the diviner claim and means for upbuilding the Church of Christ were prospered. Built on the rock, our church will stand the storms of ages. The first Church of Christ Scientist, our prayer in stone, will be the prophecy fulfilled, the monument upreared of Christian Science. End of her quote. Upbuilding is a verb, so is upreared. Perhaps these verbs point to the continuing activity of church building, the creation that is ever appearing and must ever continue to appear. To that end, it's time to take a closer look at nouns and verbs. William Safire. Anyone know William Safire? Not many. He's won some Pulitzer Prizes for his political writing, and he's widely recognized as a grammar expert. He writes a column on language in the New York Times. He wrote a delightful little book for writers called Fumble Rules. Each of the 50 fumble rules contradicts itself to make a point. Here's some examples. Verbs has to agree with their subjects. What? Isn't that right? Don't use no double negatives. Never use a long word when a diminutive one will do. One of my personal favorites, don't verb nouns. In fact, I considered the talk, but John probably never would let me get away with it. Don't noun verbs. As I said earlier, this beautiful building is more than just a beautiful building. It's also an idea. Okay, when you were given the list of my citations, on the back of it, there's a quiz. I'm a college professor, so I give quizzes. I can't help it. I'm going to give you a word building, and I'll give you a few sentences. You've got to circle, is it a noun or a verb? Here's your first sentence. We are building a church. Okay, noun or verb, noun or verb. Okay, and you can just say it out loud. What do you think? You got lucky, okay. Next one. We're in a church building. Well, not so bad. We're in the church building, building church. Yeah, you got it, both. Sometimes physical exercise, like lifting weights and so forth, is called bodybuilding. Mrs. Eddy had something else in mind in this report on one of her sermons. The report ran that in her early training, through a misinterpretation of the word, it had been the cause of years of invalidism on Mrs. Eddy's part. With the understanding of scripture meanings had come physical rejuvenation. The uplifting of spirit was the upbuilding of the body. So what is the work of building church? It's already a structure, of course. It's the structure of truth and love. It rests upon and proceeds from its infinite principle. And as experienced, witnessed by humanity, as we've heard already today, the church is that institution, comma, important comma. It is that institution which affords proof of its utility and is found elevating the race, rousing the dormant understanding from material beliefs to the apprehension of spiritual ideas and the demonstration of divine science, thereby casting out devils or error and healing the sick. Now, have you ever heard someone say, I'm spiritual, or I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not interested in institutional religion? You ever hear that? I thought so. Yeah. Have you ever thought that yourself? Okay. You don't have to raise your hands on that one. Perhaps a person saying that feels cramped by rules, by structure. Perhaps they want their truth unstructured, natural, individual, tailored to their ideas, not defined or limited by others. It made me think, what gives a tree structure? Well, roots, trunk, branches, and so forth. What would a tree be without structure? A leaf pile. Then, because I have done some fishing in my life, what would a fish be without structure? Would kind of be like an amoeba with scales. Without, actually, even amoeba has structure. Amoeba couldn't even move without structure. But these statements about institutionalized religion that seem so current kind of paint the word institution with unwanted graffiti. As a whiff of stodgy, boring, old, rigid, so forth. Of course, if we eliminate these qualities in our thought, they can't possibly appear in our church. So, is church building a noun or a verb? Could we think of the word institution as the act of instituting, as something that continues, that is active, that is present? I wonder if that's why Mrs. Eddy didn't use the obvious noun institute in her definition. Another thing that struck me when I was preparing the talk, have you ever noticed that the words institute and substitute look a lot alike? Ever wondered what that means? Well, I looked them up. In law, the first heir to whom an estate is given is the institute, the first heir, the proper heir. If the first heir is no longer available, the estate passes to a secondary heir, a substitute. Thus, our church is the intended heir of truth and love. It's the original. It is not a substitute. We might say it's the instituting, the institution or constituting of principle, a continuing unfolding of truth and love in human experience. It's a verb just as much as it's a noun, maybe more so. More to say about that. And a question to raise when we hear those saying, yeah, I'm looking for more freedom. Could there be any freedom outside the structure of truth, the very truth that makes free? The quiz continues. You have 4 more here. These will be on the final exam. Love. Is love a noun or verb? Both. So without a context, you can't tell. Are you in love? Which is it, noun or verb? Noun. The in's the preposition. Did you fall in love? Noun. Good so far. Or perhaps in love, lowercase, and in love, uppercase. Both nouns. A student once asked Mrs. Eddy, "Do you love me?" Mrs. Eddy pointed to the stove in the room. She said, "Do you see the stove? It warms. I love." Verb or noun? Definitely a verb. And look at all the verbs in the definition of church. Affording proof, proving, elevating, cleansing, rousing, stirring, casting out, healing. And then look how that definition corresponds with the seal of Christian Science. Have you ever noticed that? Elevating the race, cleansing those most in need of cleansing, rousing the dormant, raising the dead or sleeping, casting out devils, and healing the sick. Grand and powerful verbs, every one. Isn't this verb-centered flavor of church hinted in the church manual when it describes it as designed to be built? Building is a verb, a doing, not a done deal noun. Time for a story. This gives me a chance to sneak in bird pictures here. I've got over 500. This may take a while. One morning, I was praying by a picture window. A little bird mistook reflection for sky and crashed hard into the glass. Going outside, I found a motionless, crumpled form under the window. Ironically, I had just been praying with two synonyms for God, life and principle. And I declared that the only life was God, was principle. So life could not be fragmented or deformed. That would be unprincipled. And since principle is life, no principle-sustained idea could accidentally fail or die. It lives. And this principle is not some lifeless cold principle like the principle of hydraulics. This principle is life itself. It's expressed, it lives, it moves, it has being. It sustains, supports, and upbuilds. The lie of accident and injury was rejected. It was set aside. It couldn't be. And as I felt the truth of this thinking, this situation naturally corresponded. The bird stirred, got up on his legs, couple minutes, flew away, demonstrating the vitality and healing power of life, of its principle. You could say the bird became less of a noun and more of a verb. I wouldn't say that, of course, but you could. But this wasn't the end of the story. I had a wonderful feeling of impending good. The feeling that this healing pointed to a continuously operating principle, that I would revisit that principle, that promise, later that day. And we notice, of course, that the word foundation, the foundation of our church, can be thought of as a verb too, as the founding, the ongoing founding of church, pointing to Mrs. Eddy's continuing role as the continuing founder of Christian Science. So more to come on this channel. As long as we're talking about building, what shapes appear in God's architecture? In the superstructure we're building on this foundation. Lines, planes, rectangles. Mrs. Eddy writes in Miscellaneous Writings, Christian Science translates mind, God, to mortals. It is the infinite calculus, defining the line, plane, space, and fourth dimension of spirit. And of course, the city foursquare in Revelation is another example of inspired architecture. But I'd like to suggest another primary structure in God's architecture, the sphere. It's time for the geometry lesson. You knew that, right? Everyone knew that? Yes. I mean, if you hire a math teacher to give a talk, what'd you expect? Okay. Mind is perpetual motion. This is Mrs. Eddy in Science and Health. Mind is perpetual motion. Its symbol is the sphere. The rotations and revolutions of the universe of mind go on eternally. The real life, or mind, and its opposite, the so-called material life and mind, are figured by two geometrical symbols, a circle or sphere and a straight line. The circle, continuing Mrs. Eddy's quote, the circle represents the infinite without beginning or end. The straight line represents the finite, which has both beginning and end. The sphere represents good, the self-existent and eternal individuality or mind. The straight line represents evil, a belief in a self-made and temporary material existence. And that's the end of her quote. Now, modern geometry teachers would call this a line segment. It has a beginning, it has an end. Is this a good model for the building that we've been talking about? Well, I don't think so. You notice there's a place where there isn't a line, and then the line is suddenly created and lives for a while, and then all of a sudden there is no more, it runs out. Beginning, end. This is the mortal model, isn't it? It's the model of birth, growth, maturity, decrepitude, decay, and death. Whether we apply this to a person, a body, a building, or a church, it's still just the mortal model. Mrs. Eddy asks in recapitulation, question, what is error? And includes in the answer, error is a supposition that pleasure and pain, that intelligence, substance, life are existent in matter. It is that which seemeth to be and is not. End of her quote. Now, who here has heard the expression, you're just handing me a line? Anybody ever heard that? What does it mean if they say, you're just handing me a line? Well, it means you're being handed a lie, a mortal model, a beginning and end. Now, what holds the lie? What contains the lie? Well, it's in belief. It's not a thing. It's not an actuality. It's that which begins and ends. In fact, included in Mrs. Eddy's answer about what is error, she says, quote, error is a belief without understanding. And that's the end of her quote. Now, a circle or a sphere is entirely different. Where's the start of a circle? Yeah, point to the start. Well, or the end? Continuous being, unfoldment of already existing, always existing, ever existing being. Now, one thing you can do on a line, because it is a line, you can order things. You can say, okay, A is at the beginning, B is between A and C, and B comes before C. Or even better or worse, you can say A is above B, and B is above C. C is underneath everything. Try that with a circle. Who's on top? Well, it's not exactly clear. Is B between A and C? Well, you could get from A to C without going through B. There's no sense of linearity, of ordering, of rank, of judgmental comparison in a circle or a sphere. Now, here a line segment appears to be touching a circle. But as Mrs. Eddy stated, eternal mind and temporary material existence never unite in figure or in fact. So if we magnify the circle more and more closely, they look close, but at any magnification, the line only touches a circle at a single point. Now, if you can remember back to your last geometry class, how big is a point? About 1/8 of an inch? 1/millionth of an inch? How big is a point? 0. Exactly 0. So how much does the line have in common with the circle? Exactly nothing. Similarly, Mrs. Eddy writes, matter has no place in spirit, and spirit has no place in matter. Truth has no home in error, and error has no foothold in truth. Even though they seem to touch, one is still a curve, and the other a straight line. Now, if we spin a circle, we make a sphere. And as Mrs. Eddy knows, the sphere also has no beginning, no end, no ordering. What's the radius of mind as sphere? It is infinite. The radius is infinite, which means what? It means each one of us is always at the exact center of mind, and that in every direction, mind extends infinitely far. Who's at the center of mind? Everyone. Mrs. Eddy writes, God is at once the center and circumference of being. Now, one of our newest hymns, hymn 591, was actually a poem by Peter Henniker Heaton that voices some of this everywhereness, this sphere of infinite radius. We cannot turn away from God, because whichever way we face, Spirit is there in every place, every direction, everywhere. Spirit is there. Whether we turn to left or right, to north or south or east or west, we meet with love and we are blessed. Upward or down, below, above, we meet with love. This also corresponds to the city foursquare. The length and the breadth and the height of it, 12,000 furlongs, 1,500 miles. And in Revelation we read, the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it. For the glory of God did light in it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. And Mrs. Eddy amplifies that in Science and Health. She writes, its gates open towards light and glory both within and without, for all is good. And nothing can enter that city which defileth or maketh a lie. No lines. Light within and light without. The sphere of light filling all space, all thought. That is an impenetrable shield in every direction against the so-called powers of darkness. Darkness has no weapon against light and cannot defend itself against light. Imagine an arrow or a bullet or a germ made entirely of darkness. What happens as it enters light? Vanished. Can't help it. Now, a little side note here. When I was in college, my druggy college friends tried to convince me of all I was missing by not doing drugs. And they finally gave me their best shot. One afternoon in the dorm, they said, but Tom, have you ever seen the universe from the outside? And I said, no, and neither have you. There is no outside. Likewise, there's no outside to life, to mind, to love. There's no outsider. No one can be outside the infinite radius of this mind, this truth, this good, this light. So that concludes today's geometry lesson. Now, since I'm a teacher, I have to assess learning. Did you get any useful ideas out of the geometry lesson? If so, please raise your hand. This affects my stipend. This is important. Okay. Yeah, John, did you get a picture? Okay, good. And it's now time for the astronomy lesson. What? If you hire the associate director of the astronomical observatory, what do you expect? Oh, well. Here's one of my personal favorite spheres. Anyone recognize this sphere? It's the sun. By the way, what's a nickname for the sun? Soul. Ah, good. Extra point, extra credit. Yeah. By the way, as John mentioned, these pictures were by NASA. I wish I had taken these, but no, I haven't gotten up there yet. Time for imagination. Imagine you're a ray of light coming from the sun, shining out from the sun, out into space. You might shine on Earth at some point, although the Earth is kind of a moving target. How fast is the Earth moving around its orbit around the sun? Extra credit question. Pretty close, 67,000 miles an hour, very close. Okay, you can skip the final exam. So, here's a picture of the sun, picture of the Earth. We're above them. We're above the North Pole, about 1 million miles above the North Pole, looking down at the Earth, going around the sun. and the little beam shining out. And actually, this is not to scale. The sun would have to be way, way further away, and the Earth would be way, way smaller. But it gives the idea. Now, as the Earth is whipping around at 67,000 miles an hour, it's getting closer, closer, getting closer, closer. Almost. Now what's happened? That beam that was shining out into space is now shining on the Earth. But how much difference does that make to a sunbeam? Have you ever thought about the identity of a sunbeam? It's millions of colors, several million that we can see, a billion more colors that we can't see, ultraviolet, infrared, and so forth and so on. And all of that warmth, that radiance, that delight sparkles, scintillates every single second. That identity remains the same, whether it's shining on the Earth or shining someplace else. The sunbeam just beams away. Okay, now we're still above the North Pole, but we're closer. You can see the North Pole here. And the ray, the beam shining out from the sun is going to trace a path across the Earth as it gradually moves, as the Earth is moving by the beam. And now we shifted our perspective. We're kind of looking at the Earth sort of from the sun's direction, but we're a lot closer to the Earth than the sun is. And here the Earth has moved into the beam. Now the beam just touches the Earth. And as the Earth zips by at 67,000 miles an hour, the beam moves across the surface. How long will that sunbeam rest on the Earth? It kind of depends on how fast or where it hits on the Earth. It doesn't pass on the speed because that doesn't change. Well, if the beam hit the Earth right at the equator, it would take about 7 minutes for the Earth to move through the beam, beginning to end, gone. Now, if the sunbeam hit a little higher on the Earth, if it went through San Francisco, St. Louis, etc., well, the Earth isn't as wide up there. About 5.5 minutes, the beam is gone. And if the beam landed right at almost the North Pole, it may only shine on the Earth for a few seconds. Does this make a difference to the beam? No. It shines, it scintillates, it shares its millions, billions of colors, constantly scintillating, glowing, changing, evolving. It doesn't matter where it's shining. It's reminiscent of hymn 14, "Arise, arise and shine, on thee hath dawned the day. God is thy sun, and Christ thy light. Be thou a steadfast ray." And thinking about Mrs. Eddy's hymn, "As we are Christ-like, we are a gentle beam of living love." Time for another story. I had a beautiful and talented high school friend who was just filled with earthly promise. She was known as the best young operatic voice in Virginia. She actually had a leading role in a local opera at the age of 15. She was second runner-up for Miss Virginia. She loved children and delighted them with her Donald Duck voice, better than Donald Duck himself. Get those kids giggling. While driving in Western Virginia one morning, I heard of her passing, that she had passed on the radio. As I drove through the woods, I felt an overwhelming sense of tragic loss and emptiness. She was so young, barely in college, and she had so much to offer. As tears made driving difficult, I stopped by the roadside in the silent forest and prayed for understanding and comfort. Love quietly sent me an astronomy angel. Wasn't that nice of love? I noticed streams of sunlight shining through the misty morning forest. This precious angel touched me with the question, "What's the source of these luminous rays?" I answered, I thought, "It's the sun. These graceful beams are shining out from the sun, left the sun 8 minutes ago." The angel asked again, "Where were these rays several minutes ago?" It was just after morning, it's just after dawn. I knew the Earth must be just turning into the sun. Since it's moving so briskly along, several minutes ago, these rays of light were shining out into deep space. And then after the Earth has moved past the rays, they'll be shining far out into space again. Perhaps they only land on the Earth for 5.5 minutes. And if a ray happened to land close to the North Pole, it may only touch the Earth for a few seconds. The angel message became clearer. All the beauty and grace and music, and even the Donald Duck voice that made kids giggle, those were qualities shining directly out from soul. These qualities and the exact representation of them that I knew as that opera singer had always been shining out from father-mother love, and they always would. Not only are those qualities always expressed, but they're always seen, appreciated, and loved. They're always delighting others, because man is both the manifestation and the object of God's affection. And my friend's spiritual identity, the substance of her being, would always be safe, whole, perfect, loved in God. Again, from Science and Health, continuing our definition of man, let us remember that harmonious and immortal man has existed forever and is always beyond and above the mortal illusion of any life, substance, and intelligence as existent in matter. Even if the ray touched the Earth near the North Pole for just seconds, it would have existed forever, and it will remain its radiant self forever, and every other beam would delight in it. Only the lie of time would suggest that we start one minute and end another. We or our friends or church or any building Verb that we're doing. That was never God's view of our work or our being, any more than 7 minutes of earthfall is the sun's view of one of its rays. In a paragraph with a marginal heading, The Divine Loveliness, Mrs. Eddy writes in Science and Health, being possesses its qualities before they are perceived humanly. Beauty is a thing of life which dwells forever in the eternal mind and reflects the charms of his goodness in expression, form, outline, and color. That's the end of her quote. And by the way, the piece of paper that you're holding has all of the quotes, all the sources there. At that moment, I felt the nearness and dearness of God's specific love for me and for my friend. I felt lifted and warmed and satisfied, basking in the unquenchable light of life. What a generous and glorious answer God had sent to my questing prayer, and how thoughtful love was to send me an astronomy angel. And I share that angel with you today. But there's more. We don't relate to each other by our own efforts or our own organization or heredity or by the line of time. We're joined at the hip, as they say, or perhaps more accurately, we're joined at the sun, or as one of you said a minute ago, we're joined at our very soul with each other. I am joined to that opera singer and to every one of God's children by my very soul, and so are you. So is all of church. There cannot be a discordant relationship in church or anywhere. Joined at the soul, joined at the mind, assures perfect harmony, even with limitless originality and individuality. And as you've pointed out, soul is soul. Great metaphor. Wish I'd thought of it. Again, from Mrs. Eddy, the sinless joy, the perfect harmony and immortality of life, possessing unlimited divine beauty and goodness without a single bodily pleasure or pain, constitutes the only veritable, indestructible man whose being is spiritual. It also constitutes the only veritable, indestructible church whose building is spiritual. Verb. Here's another friend joined at the soul. His name is Gil Ives. He was perhaps my closest birding buddy. We've been birding more times than I can count. He gave a testimony in the Elsa Church that touched me deeply. He has passed off the earth. His beam passed off some years ago, and his son has passed off the earth. But I was able to find his granddaughter a month ago. She had never heard her granddad's testimony. I was so grateful to hear it. And I asked if it would be okay to share it with you today, and she said, of course. So here it comes. Gil fought in World War II. He was captured by the Nazis and thrown into a prison camp. The conditions were unthinkably bad. Over 100 men were jammed into a cell that might barely have allowed a dozen or two of them to lie down. The sanitation was dreadful, the stench was worse. Disease was rampant. A viciously contagious disease found its way into the prison cell. Men caught it and died in a day or two. The prison guards would drag the bodies out every morning. Gil was a devout Christian Scientist at this time and prayed for himself and prayed for his fellow prisoners constantly. Nonetheless, he caught the disease. He was soon very sick, very close to death. He was passing in and out of consciousness. In a lucid moment, he had the thought, if only I could call a Christian Science practitioner, I could be healed. An angel message came. There are very many Christian Science practitioners praying for man all around the world, in the United States, in Germany, in Japan. They are praying for those in service, and they are praying for peace. A second message came to his thought. You are that man. These prayers are effective, and you can see the results. Gil says, I was healed in 2 hours. I never lost consciousness again since that time. This was more than 60 years ago when he gave the testimony. I came home not long thereafter when the prison camp was liberated by the Allies and completed the recovery, but I never lost consciousness again. And I declare for myself constantly, prayer is effective and I can see the results. Think of the word nurse. By the way, is that a noun or a verb? Both? Just as surely as there were and are Christian Science practitioners praying, watching, healing at every hour, there are surely Christian Science nurses doing so as well. A Peace Haven friend, not a Christian Scientist, although he loved to have Christian Scientists babysit his children, had occasions to watch Christian Science nurses. He was amazed at their coordination, their quickness, their mental and physical athleticism. He commented on their ability to come into a room where there was a need, all fresh, not riveted to the condition, but alert, mentally awake, ready to determine the tactical need, make a plan, take the steps required, and then move on to the next one. He said, and I love this comment, it's the reason I'm telling this story, this is the Navy SEAL Team 6 of the Christian Science movement. That's not bad. That's pretty good. I think the Navy SEALs would be proud, frankly. I think Gil would too. Mrs. Eddy observes that Jesus introduced the teaching and practice of Christianity in an age of ecclesiastical despotism. That was his age. Are we in such an age? Are we introducing the teaching and practice of Christian Science in an age of ecclesiastical despotism? Well, maybe our ecclesia, our prevailing church, is the Church of Materia Medica. I noticed a radiology clinic in St. Louis has large stained glass windows in its huge lobby. That got my attention. And what Mrs. Eddy called our systematized centers are daily on the front line to free mankind from that despotism. Christian Science nurses are at the ready 24/7, 365, as we've heard wonderfully just a few minutes ago. Trained, prepared, alert, ready to meet the need in homes, facilities, schools, camps, Our SEAL teams are always at their post, and we are grateful. And we are most grateful when we go and do likewise. We all can pray for the world, as we heard again just a few minutes ago. Now, speaking of 24/7, 365, those are all measures of time. Time is another example of being handed a line. Have you been handed a line about time? It's definitely got limits, befores and afters. Yep, sounds like a line to me. Eternity, on the other hand, is not linear. It must be a sphere. Yep, you can skip the exam also. As we keep thought in tune with the infinite, we're building on eternity. As Mrs. Eddy wrote to her students, this is in Miscellaneous Writings, quote, "My noble students who are loyal to Christ, to truth, and human obligations will not be disheartened. They build for time and eternity." And then in First Church of Christ Science and Miscellany, remember that a temple but foreshadows the idea of God, the house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Okay, next to last question on the quiz. What is this building and where is it? That's the last question on the quiz. If this will be graded. And not hearing any answers. The chapel? No. It's louder.
It's a castle.
A castle? Nice guess, but no. It's sort of like a castle. It looks a little like a castle. It's a wall. Ooh, somebody said wall. Not the great. In Israel. You're so close. This is the wall around Jerusalem. Now, it's been built and rebuilt several times, but the stones close to the base, you look down close there, those stones date back more than 2,500 years. Guess who probably handled some of those stones? Nehemiah. Those same stones. They were there. Now, Nehemiah also had to deal with time robbers, handing him a line. Reading from Nehemiah. And this is Nehemiah speaking, first person. "Then said I unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem, the Arabian, heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us, and said, What is this thing that ye will do? What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I them, and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. Now listen to how he counteracted the time robbers. Portion implies what? No portion implies no present occupancy. Right implies what? If you have a right, you have a claim in the future. No future. Memorial implies what? A past occupancy. He was denying evil a past, a present, or a future. He shattered his claim to power or presence and opened the way for the upbuilding that followed. You remember the introduction that opens way to the Bible lesson every Sunday, affirming its application to all ages, past, present, and future. And we're also regularly reminded to daily watch and pray to be delivered from all evil, from prophesying, judging, condemning. Yeah, they're more counseling, influencing, and being influenced erroneously. But think about those first three. Erroneous prophecy is pointing to a misunderstanding of the future. A misjudgment, judging erroneously, is pointing to a misunderstanding of the present. And condemning erroneously would be a misunderstanding of the past. So in all these ways, we're counteracting these thoughts. As Mrs. Eddy put it in the chapter Teaching Christian Science, judge not the future advancement of Christian Science by the steps already taken, lest you yourself be condemned for failing to take the first step. Can we always take the first step? Of course. Now, one of the healings and fruitage, I love reading the healings and fruitage. They are for the assurance and encouragement of the reader. So if you ever need assurance and encouragement, there's a chapter for you. This testifier said, I will never forget this morning, the forever coming of Christ to consciousness. And this metaphor of morning, of dawn, appears so often in the Bible and in so many places in our literature. There's an example, it was written by Julia Michael Johnson. It's written in the third person, but it describes her father and her father and her. It was in the series called Elizabeth and Andy, if you remember that. Some do, yes. Okay, this is quoting now, Mrs. Johnson. Her dad awoke her well before dawn one morning and asked if she wanted to see God's power. She eagerly arose, got dressed, and walked with her dad to the apple orchard. As dawn drew close, her dad explained that God's power is like the sunrise. There is no noise, no pushing, no fighting, no destruction with it. It is so gentle that a blade of grass cannot be hurt by its touch, and yet so mighty that nothing can stop it. The light, as it unfolds, touches everything that you can see and much that you cannot see. Wherever it comes, the darkness goes. The dawning is so still, so beautiful, so sure, so near, as is the power of God. And that's the end of Mrs. Johnson's quote. I love to watch dawn. I love to take pictures of it. And I know how fast it approaches. If next morning, as it's coming toward dawn, think about how quickly the Earth is rotating around toward the dawn. 800 miles an hour in San Francisco. Faster than the speed of sound. The dawn is approaching. Now, imagine if all 7.7 billion of Earth's citizens yelled at the top of their voice, "There is no light." By how much would that delay dawn? A second? No. Nothing can delay our individual or collective advance into the light, the current running heavenward, nor the collective advance of church into the light, not by a second. And the lesson we heard this morning reminded us that God's compassion is new every morning. At this speed, we effortlessly leave fear and resistance far behind. Now, we interrupt this presentation for an interview with one of our city's most distinguished citizens. This is Mr. 2+2. Doubtless have heard of him. Good day, 2+2. Hi, Tom. So 2+2, how's life treating you these days? Well, frankly, not so well, Tom. As you know, I used to be 4. Now in my good days, I'm barely 3.7. Last week, the best I managed was about 3.1. Sorry to hear that, 2+2. Say, I see a photo on the mantle. Tell me about that. Yeah, that's me in my youth when I was on the crew. I was rowing in position 4, as you can see. Oh, those were wonderful days. I was 4 every day, all day, right as rain. It's been a long time since I was 4, though. Well, I guess age catches up with all of us. I can see you're getting a little gray on top. Yeah, I know. If this keeps up in a few years, I'll be down to 2.8 and all too soon, probably 0. Well, thank you for the interview, 2 plus 2, and there it ends. What's wrong with this picture? What's impossible about the picture? Can 2 plus 2 ever become anything but 4? No. Why not? Because it is an idea. The idea of 2 plus 2 can never become anything but the idea 4. An idea doesn't age. You are an idea. We are all ideas. Church is an idea. We don't exist in the confine of line, the entwining vine of time. We only exist in mind, in eternity. And our church building, Verb, only exists in eternity, designed to be built. It's not in a line. It's as timeless as truth. An almost final story. Good news, isn't it? Yeah, okay, we're coming. Had a friend interested in philosophy and later in Christian Science. I shared Science and Health with him. We talked about it sometimes. He was fascinated with the concept of eternity, but had a hard time grasping it, as do we all, I suspect. After many attempts to explain it, an odd new approach came to my thought. I told him that the general notion of eternity is a long timeline, a sort of stretched out sequence of seconds, hours, days, years, centuries. It came to me to say eternity is entirely different from a line. If time is blue, eternity is not a really, really, really lot of blue. Eternity is yellow. It's completely different from time. It's just yellow. This latched on to something inside him. He got it. He was deeply grateful. Years later, when he would send me a letter, anybody remember letters? It's kind of like email, but it's printed and it takes longer. He would always end the letter with these 3 words: eternity is yellow. It's not a really, really long line. It's a sphere. A church built for eternity is building on a completely different basis. The rock, Christ. Now, one final story to put to rest the lie of time here. I remember the healing of the bird. And then after that wonderful healing, there was a feeling of impending good, and that I would revisit that promise, that insight, sometime during that day. It's a wonderful way to begin a day. We should begin every day saying, this is the promise. It's coming. You know, where next? That afternoon, I heard a loud crash and a scream from our toddler. In the very same second I heard the crash and scream, silent, both together, the thought came, this is the promise. I was filled with the conviction I'd felt that morning. The principle of this life, the life that's principle, there was no opportunity for fear. I took her in my arms. She had fallen face first and was bleeding freely from cuts both inside her mouth and outside her mouth. But I just cast that picture out. That had nothing to do with the life and the principle that had come to thought so quickly. I sang a hymn, Feed My Sheep, which we just sung a few minutes ago, quietly through the screaming. I rejoiced in that inspiration, God's allness, wholeness, onlyness, and tender immediacy. I had rejected the notion life was fragmented, or that anyone could be the child of principle and at the same time the helpless victim of an accident. After a few seconds, the screams quieted to just crying. And in perhaps a minute, she whimperingly joined me in the second verse. And soon she was singing full voice right along with me. In another minute, the end of the hymn hopped out of my lap, went back to play some more. As I cleaned her, I noticed that each gash had been replaced by a completely sealed thin red line. That's all that there was. The bleeding had stopped completely. And when I next saw her, a couple hours later, the lines themselves had vanished. The truth of the situation was so immediately evident that the injury just never went anywhere, never got anywhere. It just didn't have any time to belong to her. It vanished timelessly. And part of your homework, I'm a college professor, let's try to face every challenge with that same confidence as it comes up, as nurses do all day long. This is the promise. That's all this is. This is the promise. Oh boy. How big is our church? The church we are building, the church we occupy, the sphere of its reach and its domain. You've heard the saying, the church within is the church you're in. And Mrs. Eddy referred to the temple erected first in the hearts of its members. In miscellaneous writings, she says, more love is the great need of mankind, a pure affection, concentric, forgetting self, forgiving wrongs, and forestalling them, should swell the lyre of human love. A concentric affection, sounds like our sphere. You could say underlying, overlying, and encompassing. I wouldn't, of course, but you could. And think of a church of individual beings living this love, shining out, and all joined at the very soul, all engaged in building church, in the verbs of church, in doing church, so to speak. What does each beam do for church or bring to church? The sunlight glints from the church dome, glances into the prison cell, glides into the sick chamber, brightens the flower, beautifies the landscape, blesses the earth. Man, made in his likeness, possesses and reflects God's dominion over all the earth. Man and woman, as coexistent and eternal with God, forever reflect, in glorified quality, the infinite Father, Mother, God. And in Mrs. Eddy's admonition to her church, just as true today as it was when it was written, hitherto I have observed that in proportion as this church has smiled on his little ones, he has blessed her. Throughout my entire connection with the Mother Church, I have seen that in the ratio of her love for others, hath his love been bestowed upon her, watering her waste places and enlarging her borders. The final word is from Isaiah. Ye shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing. And all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Now, with all those trees clapping away, I certainly don't need any more clapping. What I'd like to do, I'd like to ask us to take a couple minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes, and quietly think about what you've heard, what you're hearing, and then we'll just stand. A couple quiet minutes. Thank you all for your stillness.
Thank you, Tom.